This is The Literary City with me, Ramjee Chandran.
Hello, my name is Pranidheen, but you can call me P. That's P with an A, not another E. Welcome to the Literary City with Ramjee Chandran. Well, that's the name of the show because Ramjee is the host of this podcast. But today, there's an interesting twist. Ramjee is not the host, he's the guest. And that happened because Ramjee Chandran is the author of a new book called For No Reason at All, published by Penguin. It hit the stands a couple of months ago. And because, well, he can't interview himself, we asked the executive editor of Penguin, Karthik Venkatesh, to interview Ramjee. I'm so excited about this one because this is one of the most entertaining and interesting books I've read recently. Go ahead and call me biased, but I bet you'll agree with me. Now go get the book. Trust. Now, here's our host for today, Karthik Venkatesh. He will tell you about the book and interview the author, and I'm sitting here in the studio wondering if Ramjee will forget he's the guest and jump in and ask himself something. I'm kidding, of course. Well, without wasting any time, I need to say, Karthik Venkatesh, welcome to the Literary City.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Now, over to you, Karthik.
Here I come, Ramjee. Are you old enough to remember the 1980s? Or have you heard stories from someone else about that tumultuous decade? To cut a long story short, the 80s were, to put it simply, a decade of breathtaking ups and deep, deep downs. Things were, well, all over the place. In India, a combination of political, social, and religious troubles threatened more than once to tear the country apart. And then to top it all, there was the violent transition in the middle of that decade from one prime minister to another in circumstances that can only be described as unfortunate. That was not all. The 80s were also a decade of great economic upheaval, and India grappled with the rising tide of computerization and what it meant for a country like ours with its huge population. Ramjee Chandran spent much of the 80s in New Delhi, the city where much of the action as far as the politics and economics was concerned was taking place. From what he observed in that decade has emerged For No Reason at All, a novel set in that time which gives us an insider's view of an industrial problem that went right up to the young new Prime Minister who had just taken over, Rajiv Gandhi. Between Rajiv, Ramjee's protagonist, Nilla, Nilla's bête noire, Anand Seshadri, and a number of other characters, For No Reason at All is a riveting portrait of the 80s. And here to talk about the decade, the novel, its writing, and much else is none other than Ramjee Chandran himself. So, Ramjee, welcome to your own show.
I never thought I'd get to the point where this would happen, where I'm a guest on my own show, but let me say that it feels very liberating.
It does?
You have to do all the research. I just wrote the book.
Oh, okay. But you did all the research for the book, didn't you?
I suppose so. But thank you for having me on my show.
Thank you for making me an interview on your show.
Oh, I'm delighted to. But for our listeners, I think it should be said that when I signed up with Penguin, my request to you was that you personally edit the book. And so now here I am publicly, formally thanking you for that.
Thank you. It was a pleasure editing the book. What do I say? I have memories of the 80s. I'm that old.
Right.
And revisiting it was, something of an experience. I remembered it obviously as a child, but here you were an adult in the 80s, living this very, very cool life and, writing about it. It kind of gave me a very, very different view of things.
I guess so. But, from the point of view of my protagonist, I think the word adult should be used a little loosely.
Well, legally, he was an adult. Let's put it
It
that
is true.
way.
It is true. That is true.
So I'm going to ask you, Ramjee, you were obviously a young man in the 80s in Delhi and all of that. What do you remember of that crazy decade? What are the things that come to your mind?
At that point in time, actually the 8 years, I spent almost 10 years in Delhi, but let's say the 8 years were very significant between 1980 and 1988. And I was a lobbyist, and all I did with my colleagues was to go to the government offices and represent the interests of a South Indian group of companies called the Seshasai Group, which used to be a single group until the Monopolies Commission broke them up into individual companies. But in Delhi, we still represented that group as one, even though they were disparate companies with nothing to do with each other. Nonetheless, so in the course of that, our job in Delhi was to represent the interests of my client to the government, central government, in the days of heavy licensing, in the same manner that a lawyer might represent the interests of his or her client to the court. That is exactly how it worked out. So you had to be familiar with the laws, you had to be familiar with everything else, and have to deal with what is our court, which is the central government. And the reason I say the 80s was significant, because the first 4 years, the Prime Minister was Indira Gandhi, and it went pretty much by her diktat. She was a very strong woman. I mean, she was assassinated. 1984 to 1988 were the years of Rajiv Gandhi. And everything changed. Everything changed because he arrived there saying that we've got to liberalize, we've got to open up the economy, we have to do all of these things. So visiting the government offices every day and being privy to everything that is going on, including things we shouldn't be privy to, it was very interesting to get a ringside seat. And as a young man in his 20s, I can only be grateful for that experience.
And that's what actually, I wanted to ask you about. Now, I grew up here in Bangalore in the 80s. And for us, Delhi was this remote place.
Mm-hmm.
We had no social media. We had very little television. The Prime Minister was this remote figure whom we saw once a day on the Doordarshan news broadcast. Maybe we saw a photograph in the paper. And here you were, a 20-something young man with access to the Prime Minister, meeting him regularly, bantering with him even, all of which your protagonist also kind of does in that book. Seems kind of cool. Was it as cool as you made it out to be?
Yeah, it was very cool. I was 19 going on 20 when a set of circumstances brought me to that job. It wasn't by choice. But having been there, for the first year, I was just wide-eyed. And when I went to Delhi, I had two strikes against me. Number one is 19 going on 20. All my cohort, all the other lobbyists of all the other companies were at least twice my age. That's number one. Number two, I couldn't speak any Hindi at all.
Wow.
The last time I spoke Hindi was, I think I learned it in 7th standard or something, and after that, nothing. French was my second language, which I speak fluent. I couldn't speak Hindi at all. But nonetheless, when you're 19 and 20, these things don't bother you. So I just went in there and batted my eyelashes at everybody and got by. And it was reasonably successful in my job for all that. But is it cool? Yes. Because at the end of the day, when you're there in the government and you meet these people on a regular basis, they're like any other human being. And, they're familiar with people who they see all the time. So the kind of interaction, it follows in that particular manner. And of course, you would accord a certain amount of respect for age and position. But outside of that, from their perspective, you're just another guy.
So you were kind of like a young warrior plunging into battle, but you did not have a weapon. You had to sweet talk. Sweet talking was your weapon almost.
My weapon, sir, was my mind. No, I'm kidding.
So, for those of us who don't clearly understand, so what did a lobbyist day look like? You get up in the morning and then what?
So basically, you had a certain set of projects and you knew that you had to get clearances for certain things for the companies that one represented. It can go from very mundane things like some minor permission that had to get done to the level of changing policy for people, for companies. So, for instance, one of the companies that I represented there was Tamil Nadu Newsprint, which is, at the time, it was the biggest paper mill in India. I don't know if it still is, but it was a big deal at that point, which was a joint sector venture between the Tamil Nadu government, the central government came into it, as well as Seshasai paper. So that, for example, was a highly significant thing where we had to keep on altering the policies of the government to take into account something terribly new, which is making paper from sugarcane bagasse. And because of that, everything changed. So I'm not going to get into the details of all of those things. But in that manner, there were frequently things that we had to do to represent the interests and to go tell the government that a certain amount of tariff was too much for a certain thing, or that if they were going to give protection, they have to give protection to everybody and not equal. So the day was filled with that. Like every other lobby office, we had different levels of people working there. So the juniors we would send out for all the mundane stuff, all the clerical stuff. Then at a very young age, I managed to jockey myself up into a good position. So that's what it was. So the day was just generally whatever you had to achieve that day. Metchem Silicon was pretty much the same thing because, the story behind it is how we suddenly came to understand that after almost 20 years of indigenous research coming to fruition, the government suddenly wanted to set up a plant in competition by importing technology. And I found myself in the middle of that. I had to stop it. That was an exception. And that's what the book is about.
So here you have the government hell-bent on setting up its own plant.
Right.
Or rather, the civil servant, this technocrat wanting to set up his own plant.
One guy.
And then you have the private sector wanting to do its own thing.
Right.
And you are literally up against this technocrat who had, crazy power, access to all the right people. How did you even think you were going to win? Or did you even think you were going to win, or you thought it was hopeless?
Well, actually, I must say that this was the principal combatant in the battle was my former boss, R.V. Ramani, who, by the way, died last year at the age of 101. And he was the one battling it. I was a junior, fly on the wall, know little, can do even less kind of an individual. But what happened was, since I was the point man in Delhi, I had to get thrown into it and bring everything home. Also, we had to lobby, and this is the situation where lobbying actually became quite sophisticated in this case, because I had to drum up public opinion. As you said, there was no social media. There was the press. The press was very influential. So I had to take care of talking to the press, making sure the press saw our point of view and drum up enough support so that whatever it is that we wanted to say could come through the press and influence Rajiv Gandhi and the others. Well, it worked.
So what do you remember of Rajiv Gandhi? In the press, he came across as a savvy, computer age guy into all kinds of gadgets and all of that. Was he really like that?
To be fair, in 1984, nobody knew what a computer was. Everyone just stared at it pretty much. It was just beginning. At that point in time, it's not fair to ask whether Rajiv Gandhi was computer savvy, but I'll tell you this much. He was techno savvy. Was he a cool guy? Definitely. He was very cool. And did he mean everything that he said? Yes. Politics started to get the better of him after a certain point in time. I don't think his heart was in there. But up close, one-on-one, through him, through all his other ministers, he represented for a person of my age a certain hope that things were going to open up. Let's face it. He started to open up the economy. He started to embrace glasnost and perestroika 2 years before Gorbachev used those words. So he always came into it with that. Let's not forget, he had a job before he was prime minister. He was an airline pilot, which means that he had to be science savvy to be an airline pilot. It also meant that he sat in the right seat and called the guy in the left seat sir for a while, which was rather odd for a prime minister up to that point. Yeah, that's right. So he was a real guy.
Now, coming to your novel, for no reason at all, right? You detail pretty much, the ins and outs of bureaucratic Delhi in the 1980s, right. Stuff that you were doing and so on and so forth. So, am I right in assuming you kept a diary with stuff you wrote down at the end of every day, which is why you're able to kind of give us so many details?
To tell you the truth, it was all from my head. I remembered every bit. I was actually quite surprised when I started to write it, how much of detail I remembered of this whole thing. Yeah,
really? Everything from your head? No notes at all?
Zero.
Wow. That's an encyclopedic memory.
At least in this particular case.
It made that deep an impression on you, your whole involvement in this thing?
It definitely was, and I don't think I'll ever do anything as important as that. And at that point in time, it was hugely significant. Everyone could understand how significant it was for the country at that point. I was just fortunate to have been in that position at that time It's one of those right places, the right moment. So I just went in completely.
So, I mean, silicon clearly back then, and I suppose to some extent even now, was a very big deal. And I mean, I'm curious. We were coming out of the license Raj when everything had to be made in India and all that. And here was this Indian company which had developed, a way to make silicon. But here was this Indian bureaucrat trying to prevent its manufacture, wanting an American company or some other company to do it instead. What was the logic?
There was a CBI inquiry at the end of this whole thing. Rajiv Gandhi ordered a CBI inquiry to ask exactly that question. Why? In fact, the title of the novel is that. I'll tell you the reason first. One doesn't know. I mean, I have ascribed some motives to this guy wanting to put up the plant. I'll tell you what it was. It wasn't corruption. It wasn't graft. It wasn't him making money. All the usual things why, the government department would want to set up this giga-sized project that was clearly unviable and importing technology and paying huge amounts of money. To give you a sense of scale, the amount that the Department of Electronics paid Hemlock Semiconductor, which was a subsidiary of Dow Corning, they still exist, by the way. The amount of money that they paid them for designs and drawings was more than Metchem's entire plant cost. And this is the sense of the impropriety that I'm talking about. The question is, why the impropriety? And I think it was that my protagonist, Anand Seshadri, who wanted to set up this particular plant, went ahead, spent the money, and then found out that there was actually an Indian company in association with the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, who had developed the technology as good as any. So this would have posed a major embarrassment for him, first of all, for not knowing about it. Number two, this was going to be his gift to the nation.
That's how he saw it anyway.
And he saw that. I know that this is the case because I know that guy. I've interacted with him frequently, more than once. And I describe him in the book, but I think that I was being modest and kind towards him in my descriptions in the book. but the truth of the matter was, it was just ego. I don't think it was driven by anything other than, after a certain point, it was just ego. He had to put up the plant. That's all there was to it.
Drunk on power almost.
I reckon that's what it was. Also clinging onto the power that he knew that he had lost, because all that power came from Indira Gandhi. And when it moved to her son, I think that, for everyone, the transition was very sudden. But he had an in with Indira Gandhi. And when that ended, or even during the time that it didn't end, you see what happens was nobody could understand how much power he wielded. It was a relationship that could not be audited, so it was feared instead. But then, if you really look about it, the CBI asked me directly, the point blank, the guy looked at me in the eye, and he says, "Okay, sir, how much money did he make? Tell me." And they have a way of asking questions that
it wasn't quite so simple.
No, man, I think they're very trained in this, and they know timing and stuff. So no matter how much I thought I was going to hear that question, nothing prepared my cockiness to face this policeman who looks at me and says, "How much money did he make?" But the truth is, I know for a fact that it wasn't about the money. He didn't make any money. There was no money involved in this. So I told him it was ego. And he didn't like that answer because that's not something people can grapple with easily. Graft is easy.
You can't prosecute someone for
What can you do? So there was the CBI, the results of the CBI inquiry were hushed up. Nobody released it. But for those who might be interested, there is a CAG report, a Parliamentary Affairs Committee report, which pretty much tells my whole story. When Rajiv Gandhi came to Metchem Silicon for a visit, which we engineered, he saw the plant, he saw everything was fine, he saw that everything worked, he has seen the international test reports, everything was good. He couldn't understand why a controversy like this had to bubble all the way up to him. So he asked me, why did it happen? And my response to him was the title of my book. I said, "Sir, for no reason at all."
Interesting. Okay, now I'm going to ask you about another thing which is an important part of your book. It starts off as this young upstart lobbyist up against this senior technocrat. And then at some point, the whole Cold War kicks in, right?
Yeah.
The Russians want in, the Americans want in, the French want in, and all of them are quite literally after you. How did that feel? James Bondish?
Very good. It was inordinately interesting. And the odd thing is that it happened in one day that I had to meet all of these
All
people.
three agencies.
For some reason, it all happened on the same day. It was just purely coincidental. But the Americans, not directly, but through the French. So the French, some officials from the French embassy called me, and they actually used to invite me to their cultural soirees for no reason other than I spoke French. And I got along with a few of them. I made a good friend in there, who was one of the diplomats. As I said, when you're in Delhi, you become familiar with everyone. It's whoever you meet, you become familiar with them. That's all. It doesn't matter what your status is. And I was this poor, broke. If James Bond could be given a worse car to drive, that would be the one that I owned. 1961 Fiat. The doors opening the wrong way. Okay.
Okay. I can see that in my mind's eye.
Right. And in any case, the reason why all of these people came into it, the Americans came into it because they had commercial interests. They didn't have nothing more than that. They wanted to sell the technology to India, and they're very serious about supporting their technology and so on. The Russians came into it because it was all peripheral. I think it was even done at the level of the local ambassador or even below him. It was not something that went up to the Kremlin or anything like that. It was not that important. But locally for us, it was everything, right? So for them, the turning point why they decided to help me, the Soviet Union that is because they didn't want to see a silicon metal manufacturing plant in India, which was their great buddy at that point in time, that would be subject to US export regulations. So if there was ever a crunch time, and India can't export the material, silicon metal, to the Soviet Union because of the Americans wouldn't let them. Why would they let them? They wouldn't let them. So they didn't want that plant to happen, and they decided, look, if there's an alternative, and we're not just going to be a dog in the manger over here, sure, why don't we support them and let the local companies thing come up? So they actually asked for 5 kilos of silicon, which was shipped to them. They shipped it to Moscow or wherever it is they shipped it to. They tested it out. They came to their own conclusions that the material was good enough. So they were very responsible in the way they decided to support us. Not that they just said, thwart the Americans or some dramatic thing like that. It was nothing like that. They sorted it out. They found that, yes, India can have this plant, and we did have the technology. They said, with that available, why the hell are we not opposing this US export regulation-based plant to come up? And doesn't make any sense. So yeah, we'll support you. I needed that support because without that, we would not have known about all the many underhanded ways in which the government is trying to implement their project quietly so that they could spend so much of money and embarrass the government into saying, okay, let both come up. We would have been swamped.
Right.
That was the game plan. At least that's what I thought. I can't make it different.
Almost as if the universe conspired to allow Metchem to, build that plant.
Very specifically, because what we did was we got the help of this gentleman who was an atomic physicist, who was the secretary of the Department of Non-Conventional Energy Sources, as it was named then, Maheshwar Dayal. And he supported us. He didn't like it. I mean, even from the standpoint of just conviction, he didn't think that this technology should be imported from the Americans, number one. Number two, he didn't want the Department of Electronics to get their grubby paws on the material because in India, silicon metal is principally used in making solar photovoltaic cells.
Right.
Solar cells. So that's non-conventional energy. It's not electronics. Right. We don't have much of a chip making gig in India all that much, such that we should worry about making the silicon, because after you make the basic silicon metal, you can branch off and either take it towards photovoltaics or you can take it towards electronics manufacturing. You can dope the silicon to arrive at one of these two things. But we don't have much of chip making in India compared to the world. But we certainly needed photovoltaics so that we could electrify villages in remote areas and not have to draw a line through, kilometers of waistlines. Mm-hmm. So it was very useful for that. There was another very useful thing. We got very marginal support saying, basically, how the politicians are. They're like, yes, in the fullness of time, photovoltaics is important, generally speaking, and so on. Suddenly, somebody figured out that if they could power a lamp in the village, they could certainly power a television set.
Oh.
And imagine the wonders that would do for propaganda, for election speech, politicians.
Right.
Suddenly coffers were opened up, and yes, this is the most important thing in the country. So
all visionaries clearly of a certain sort.
By the way, since I was in the government, let me tell you, the switch from black and white to color was also because they wanted the politicians and the speeches to be shown well. Mrs. Gandhi looked much better in color than black and white. So,
and here we thought it was just for the benefit.
Of course, it was. Public. Sure, whatever you say, Karthik.
So some of these characters who feature in the novel, Angela, for instance, Pandey, very real, very believable. Right. So were they real, based on real people, or are they composites of different people that you met?
The people were very real. Every one of them, I represented them exactly the way they were. I went even right down to maintaining their ethnicity so that I don't take it out of there. So, I might have changed a Nerurkar to somebody else, Tarwarkar, for example. But that's about as far as I went. Otherwise, I would keep them with their ethnicity and so on. It could be another name from their exact kind of a background. But where I did take some liberties because there are some characters that I did not want revealed at all. Angela Brito is one of those people. So I have my character there working directly inside the DOE, but she was not an employee directly of the DOE. She was in an associate capacity, but there all the time.
Sure.
If I revealed that much, people would know who she is in a minute.
Sure. Now, four and a half decades after it began,
right,
and almost 4 decades after it ended,
right.
When you look back upon it, what are your thoughts? What runs through your head?
So many things. It's when I started to write it and I started to relive those days, it was very easy for me to slip right back into my skin when I was there, and I experienced all the traumas and the inadequacies that I was feeling. It just went right back in there as I was writing. And the way I write is I focus more on the craft. So, I work at it until it sounds spontaneous. What I was feeling as I was writing it was everything that I felt back then. And I started to compare those days with what I felt about the economy, what my original thoughts as a young man were about the way the economy should go, and what I feel now. Net result, I miss those days. Even though they were restrictive in many, many ways, I think that we went into liberalization without quite understanding how to handle it properly. I was very tuned into the way the economy was, because you can't be a lobbyist in Delhi and not know every twist and turn of every department's budget and what's driving them and so on. And those were the days of socialism. Those were the days of encouraging Indian science, Indian technology. This whole controversy happened because of they said they were going to do it and didn't encourage it. And so we were able to hang our hat on that peg. And it was very clear that if they encouraged businesses, if they encouraged people, encourage education, have a lot more people in the middle rather than at the two ends of the economic spectrum, things would be better. And things did get better. In my opinion, if you take a look, we're so proud to talk about so many CEOs in the US being of Indian origin and so on. I don't think that could have happened without the socialism of the 70s and even right up to the early 80s. Where we got everyone to focus on education, and that became more important. And you knew that if you needed to survive in life, you had to get out, get an education, get a job, and be on your own. You didn't have rich daddy to fund you forever. And I think that is the big difference between the then and now that I rue.
Right. So what next, Ramjee, now that you have whetted your appetite as a novelist? Are we going to see more novels from you?
I'm very tempted to write fiction. And I kind of liked it because, once I painted on that big canvas over there, I kind of liked letting my imagination flow and so on. But the first book was barely fiction, right? I mean, I had to fictionalize it. I couldn't write it as a first person account. Much of it was not based on references. Much of it was based on I was there and I saw it with my own eyes. So I can take that story up to a point. And sometimes some stories are so fantastic that they are better spoken in fictional terms than in real life. So I do want to write something on fiction coming up. But you have signed me up to write the history of Bangalore. So that's what I'm occupied with, like 16 hours a day right now.
Whoa. So we'll be expecting to see that very soon, I'm sure.
Okay. All right. That's no pressure.
No pressure. Absolutely
nice segue. Well, I'm almost at the end of chapter 1 of that book, so I've really started to write it in earnest. So I'll share my initial writings with you soon.
Great. Looking forward to that. So Ramjee, thank you so much. It was great talking to you about For No Reason at All. It was great editing it for me.
Wonderful.
And listener, I hope you will enjoy reading it as much as we enjoyed talking.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you in return for doing this, for interviewing me on The Literary City.
Pleasure is entirely mine, I assure you.
You've been listening to Karthik Venkatesh in conversation with our guest today, Ramjee Chandran, author of For No Reason at All. There's a link in the podcast description to where you can get the book. It's available anywhere you get books, but please support your local bookstores. Hey, Karthik, that was such a fun interview.
Thank you.
So, as the editor, what did you think of the book?
2 things. Great fun, right? A really, really breezy read,
Right.
and very, very evocative historically. And that's the reason really why I thought this book, really made it for me. It was funny, and it wonderfully captured the spirit of that bygone era.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's a book based on true events, and for somebody my age, we didn't know any of that. So to read history in such an entertaining way, I thought was quite interesting. So, what was your standout moment in the book?
I have some vague recollections of the 80s. I was around then, but I was rather young. What stood out for me in the book was how well he kind of captured the feel of what I suspect was the government offices of that time, and how he very skillfully wove in all his interactions with the Prime Minister of that time, Rajiv Gandhi, into the book. And that was pretty much how I remember Rajiv Gandhi of having been spoken as, back then when he was the Prime Minister. Those to me were the real standouts of the book.
Yeah. So, as an editor, what I want your opinion. Would this book have worked if he'd written it as non-fiction instead of fiction?
Let me put it this way. I think it worked better as fiction because the story itself is while interesting, could have perhaps slid into becoming very drab and matter-of-fact if presented as non-fiction. But when he worked it into a fictional kind of a space, what he did was made the characters come alive, humanize the whole interactions, the heroes, the villains, and that made the whole ride far more interesting and enjoyable.
Yeah, it was. It was a ride, like you described it. Thanks so much for doing this, Karthik, and I hope you'll come on and be a guest host for some of our other episodes as well.
One message for Ramjee: write more books, write more novels too.
Yeah, we'll get him right on that. That was a great conversation on a very interesting book, and a genre-breaking book too. I guess they call it faction. We will introduce you to many more interesting books and authors on the Literary City. I would like to thank our guest host Karthik Venkatesh and our guest Ramjee Chandran. Thank you for being here, and of course, thank you for listening. Tune in again for no reason at all. Ha! I couldn't resist. Well, I'm Pranati Madhav, and this is the Literary City with Ramjee Chandran. And as I always say, bye!